right. Well, I think hopefully Todd Zebarth will be able to join us soon. Vanessa, can you maybe give him a text or a call? Oh, there we go. I see him. He's in the. All right, I'll wait until our last panelist gets in on the link. Hey, Todd, can you hear us?
Yep. Good afternoon or morning, depending where you're at.
All right. Well, let's get underway. And Melissa, Vanessa, if you can help me admit people as they come into the waiting room, that would be great. Looks like we have about 19 people on the phone, which is actually enough to do a pretty quick round of just people saying where they're from before we dive in. This will be a webinar brought to you by the National Network for District Authorizing. And we're going to look at issues of state policies they're developing in our states and try to figure out what trends there might be or things we need to be aware of from one another's experience. Excuse me. I'm Alex Medler. I'm the governing council chair for the National Network and the executive director of CACSA. How about if we just really quickly just go around and say where we are and what state? Melissa?
I am Melissa Brady and I'm with Florida. I'm with FACSA. Thank you.
All right, David Patterson.
Dave Patterson. I'm the president of the CCAP board, California Authorizing Professionals.
And Kimberly.
I am Kimberly. I'm with CCAP, so California.
Tom.
Hi, I'm Tom. I'm from CCAP and the executive director.
And Wendy.
Hi, I'm Wendy Dodge. I'm Senior Director of Legislative Affairs and Policy for Polk County Public Schools in Florida.
And Corey.
Corey, Director of Charter School Unit here in Riverside County, California. I used to be part of CCAP as well.
Great. And Stephen Ayers.
Hi, I'm Stephen Ayers, and I'm in Marion County, Florida with FACSA.
And Todd.
Good afternoon, morning, everybody. My name is Todd Zebarth. I'm with the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. We are a Washington, D.C. based organization, but I am located in Ann Arbor, Michigan.
And Gina Koch.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Gina Koch from Miami-Dade County Public Schools, and that's in Florida.
Sarah.
Hi, Sarah Hackett in Wisconsin. I run our resource center that's new as of 4 years ago.
And Joe.
Sorry about that. Joe Hendricks, Sutter County Office of Education Deputy Superintendent in California and currently a board member with CCAP.
Great. And Sarah.
I'm assuming that me, Sarah Vandergriff. I'm the
Yes.
state policy and legal director for the Louisiana Charter School Association.
Great. Well, I see that we're now getting up to 30, so I think we will probably push to a poll strategy just to give you a sense of who's participating. If you could quickly answer that, then we'll get a sense of the rest of the states, because I think we've got quite a bit of people participating here now. Let me just give a brief overview of the things we're going to talk about and logistics. Our plan is to talk about changes in state policy. We have folks presenting from California, Colorado, and Florida, and Todd Zebarth kicking us off with some national perspective. Our intention is to inform all the states that have district authorizing about policy developments that affect that. And we expect some of them to transfer from one state to another, but not all of them. One thing, I don't know if people saw it last week, Rick Hess for the American Enterprise Institute wrote a piece explaining that there's sort of red state policy around charters and blue state policy around charters. And I'd suggest that maybe California is on our blue state spectrum on the left, Colorado is a little purpler than California, and Florida is more on the red state front. and Todd can fill us in a little bit more about what that implies for what we're trying to do. Our thought is that the district authorizers are not usually a powerful stakeholder in state policy debates, and that the members of our associations are often sort of trying to help their superintendents or their bosses or boards think about how the policy will affect them. So part of our interest is finding out what might have legs from one state to the other, and what are the trends, and what might we see coming down the pike. So I am gonna turn it over to Todd Zebarth first, but first share our poll results, and see that we have mostly folks from our 3 states, and we have Louisiana and I think some others in the category. All right. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Todd to give us a little national perspective.
Thanks, Alex. So what I want to do in my time with everybody today is just talk a little bit, reflect a little bit on the recent past, the present, and the near future of state policy and politics for charter schools. The past few years have been a bit of a roller coaster ride for public charter schools and state houses. And, I think much more so than at any previous time. And part of it is a reflection of the larger political environment in the country right now. But it's, I'll just quickly kind of go through and you'll kind of see the up and down ride we've been facing. The 2018 elections brought in a new crop of Democratic governors and state legislators that were more aligned with the teachers unions and their opposition to charter schools. I think there were about a dozen Democratic governors elected that fall. And what was unprecedented about it was we only had one who was like a full-throated charter school champion, and that's Jared Polis in Colorado. And some of that might have had to do with the fact that Jared is independently wealthy and was able to self-fund his campaign. He wasn't maybe as reliant on the unions for their support. And in just about every other state, people weren't even neutral on it. They were kind of talking about caps, talking about stopping charter growth, all of those things, which was really unprecedented. Usually at worst, Democratic governors were neutral, and we kind of are at a point, at least in that election, where at best they were neutral. So as a result of that, what we saw in 2019 was a real wave of anti-charter school legislation being introduced in places, which again, isn't unique. What was unique is it actually had a real chance of passing. So we saw in California, Illinois, Maine, and New Mexico, all places that had new Democratic governors, a lot of new state legislators, enact anti-charter school bills that weakened the laws in those states in major ways. So we were gearing up for another tough year in 2020, thinking we're going to see more of the same. And then the pandemic happens, and it derailed state legislative sessions across the country. And the maybe only silver lining of the whole thing was it stopped anti-charter school bills in their tracks in just about every place. And then the pandemic obviously has introduced a whole series of contentious issues into the debate around public policy in general, but in particular in public education, whether it's around school closures, remote learning, masks, vaccines. And then at the same, a few months into the pandemic, the George Floyd murder happens in Minneapolis, and that brings up a lot of issues around systemic racism, which have made their way into the conversation about public education. So there are 2020 kind of through the pandemic and the racial protests across the country really put these issues front and center in education. And I think not only for school districts, but also for charter schools themselves. So let me just kind of sort of finish this train of thought around the roller coaster ride, because the other thing that 2020 brought was the election of Joe Biden. And I think this was important for a few reasons. I think one is, for the first time ever, we don't have a president who's a charter school supporter. right? Bill Clinton was, George Bush was, Barack Obama was, so much so that he doubled the size of the federal charter school grant program, and Donald Trump was. President Biden isn't, right? So that makes things at the federal level a bit more complicated than in the past. In addition to that, the Biden victory removed President Trump and Secretary DeVos from office, and really they were the two biggest pro-charter school foils that our opponents have used against charter schools, not only at the federal level, but at the state level, which made it very difficult for Democratic lawmakers to support us and oppose bad things happening to us. It's pretty simple, right? You're either for Trump and DeVos or you're for us. What's the choice? And it was really hard for Democrats to say, well, we're for charter schools, but we're not for Trump and DeVos. And it made it very complicated. So you have Biden coming in. He's not a big charter supporter, but we don't have the Trump and DeVos factor anymore. And then you combine that with increasing parental frustrations and politicians' frustrations with how districts have responded to the pandemic. And all of that kind of together leads to a year in 2021 where we're actually able to get a lot of things done in red states, in blue states, and in purple states, both offensively, some good things, and then playing defense against some bad things. Maine and Rhode Island, two very blue places, beat back some very strong anti-charter school efforts. And some red states like Ohio and Oklahoma passed some things around funding and facilities in particular. So there were just across the board, it really was a kind of a surprise at how well things went in all manner of states. I think, it's carried over somewhat to this year. Yesterday, the New Mexico Senate unanimously passed a bill to give charter schools facility support in a number of ways, and included $10 million in the budget. Why that's significant is New Mexico is a very blue state right now. And there are a lot of progressive Democrats there who supported this stuff. So to me, it's sort of a beacon of hope in that, we sort of think about Republicans love us, Democrats hate us. And I've always said, Republicans don't support us as much as you think, and Democrats don't oppose us as much as you think. It's a lot more complicated. And I think that's still the case even in this polarized time. So I think, we're in 2022, it's an election year. And that tends, states tend not to do kind of bold, dramatic things in election years. But at the same time, because of the pandemic and the pressure I think that's put on lawmakers, I think we might see more states like New Mexico, whether they're red, purple, or blue, do some significant things this year. The last thing I'll mention is, the 2021 elections leading into this year, there were only in a couple of states, but they were important, really 3 states. One, California, Governor Newsom survived a recall attempt. So I think that was notable. New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy barely won re-election. And then I think the most notable thing was Glenn Youngkin beat Governor McAuliffe in Virginia. We had run a bill about 5 years ago in Virginia to overhaul their law, got it through the legislature with some Democratic support, and then McAuliffe vetoed it. Education, as I'm sure if folks were watching that race, was a huge issue in the race. Whether it was, again, CRT, critical race theory in the classroom, or vaccines and masks, or school closures, remote learning, all of those things together. And in the mix, Youngkin talked about charter schools. And so he won. He's now pushing a charter school bill there. And it's what it's doing is it's sort of raising all of these things about how do we support charter schools in this climate where there are all these other issues at play, and not be connected to one extreme side or the other. How do we keep charters focused on providing options for families, particularly those families who don't have a lot of good options right now? So I think the bottom line is the political environment for charter schools is as challenging as ever because of all of these other kind of issues at play. But I think we remain hopeful and optimistic that we can continue to get folks from both parties to come together and do good things for charters and prevent bad things from happening to them, whether it's around lifting caps, or whether it's around keeping authorizing structures in place with non-district authorizers and district authorizers, whether it's around maintaining accountability for performance, which is particularly hard right now, given the lack of testing data in a lot of states. How do we support both, district and non-district authorizers, and continuing to hold schools accountable, but doing it in a way that really makes sense given the moment that we're in, or whether that means, the funding and facility sort of perennial issues. So we're heading in, like I said, this is election year. There are 36 governor's races this fall. I think that's going to have a big impact on what we see next year, for the next few years, actually, and what kind of coalition we can hold together to support charter schools and state houses across the country. So I'll leave it there. Alex, I don't know if there's anything else you wanted me to address, but
no, I really appreciate that, Todd. I think it's a really helpful national background for the rest of our discussion. And I should add, we really appreciate Todd sharing his insights. The Alliance is probably the place with the insight into the most states around the country. So it's really helpful to get that national perspective. And I should add, the National Network and each of our state associations are quite likely to have different positions on bills or no positions on bills that Todd's talking about. And some of our members will sort of be in what might count to the Alliance as a hostile act, as something more in between. So, but I think I have one question in the chat. What do you think will happen for federal funding under the Biden administration for the CSP?
It's a great question. So for the last couple of years, we've seen the Democratic House propose a $40 million cut to the charter schools program, or the CSP. So to take it from 440 to 400 million. That the Senate has not agreed with that cut, and we've been level funded. The Biden administration has just been proposing level funding for us. Again, this year the House proposed the cut, the Senate held, and they're in negotiations on the fiscal year 22 budget around what's going to happen with that number. The Democratic House also put in some language around for-profits, and discouraging, prohibiting for-profits from being able to access, and initially had some very strong language that could have been that we interpreted to sort of say charter schools can't contract with for-profits for anything, any kinds of services. So the bottom line is the Democratic House, in particular, Congresswoman DeLauro, who's the chair of the Appropriations Committee, is very hostile to us. But the Senate is a more favorable place, both among Republicans and Democrats. And so I think from Biden, I think you'll continue to see probably level funding at best from him, his administration. This fall, I think the conventional wisdom is that the Republicans will take the House and potentially take the Senate, which will change the dynamic around this question too. But I think from the Biden administration, I don't anticipate they're going to come after us and try to cut funding, particularly when they're increasing funding for so many other things. It just doesn't make a ton of sense.
One other clarification I would make for the CSP too. I believe at this point, it's clear that they will not run a national competition for national activities funds, which is the funding source that has paid for our work so far. And so that means that there isn't likely to be a competition until next fiscal year, and they may rewrite the competitive priorities through the rulemaking process this year. So for anybody thinking about national activities grants, it's really next fiscal year is when they'll compete it, which means those monies won't be available to later, early 23 or later in the fiscal year for national activities. Well, thank you, Todd. Let's move on to a bit of our other states. Let me share our other speakers. We have David Patterson and Tom Hutton from California, me from Colorado, and Melissa Brady and Wendy Dodge from Florida. And our plan here is to do a brief summary of each state's biggest pieces, and then open it up for discussion and questions after each one. And so I will turn it over to Tom and David first.
All right, thanks, Alex, and thank you again to Todd for that national overview. We'll try to pick up on some of his themes from a California perspective. And let me say at the outset, there's a ton of stuff going on in California. We just picked 4 things on the theory that they may be the kind of very big picture ideas that have echoes in other places. And in fairness, although we always like to think that California leads on everything, some of these things were enacted or discussed in other states before California and found their way to us. And the first is one that Todd mentioned, and that is, he alluded to the House budget provision, which had some really clumsy wording at first that did seem very sweeping. Nobody thought that was really what they meant, but it was badly worded. California has a statutory provision from 2018 that does not allow charters to be or be operated by for-profit corporations, EMOs or CMOs. It's interesting, CMOs usually are defined as nonprofit to begin with, but it's in there just in case. Other states had preceded California down this path, and it was a theme that you heard in the Democratic presidential campaign and in congressional campaigns, and probably in some state campaigns as well, as, oh, I'm okay with charters, but I don't like the for-profit ones. And so California statute not only has that sort of general language, but it also attempts to get at, if you're coming at chartering, let's be candid, kind of from a business perspective, you're not unaccustomed to structuring relationships and contracts and that kind of thing in a way that can make it complicated. California's law attempts to get at that with a provision that says you can't try to circumvent it by like contracting to a contract to a contract, that sort of thing. I think in general, these provisions around the country can be gamed by sophisticated kind of efforts. But I think the bottom line for authorizers here is that it does give them more leverage to take a hard look at sort of sweeps contracts. That's the jargon for, the whole budget is in the contract, and so nothing is on the public books, and other kinds of manifestations of tail wagging the dog. There's some factors identified in the definition of operated by in the California statute that get at things like, does the company sort of formally or informally appoint all the governing board members of the school, those sorts of things that it gives authorizers some tools to look into. And then the way we're kind of going to do it on our California end is Dave or I will kick off and then ask the other. Anything to add to that, Dave?
No, I think that's a good overview.
All right, well, Dave is up next for the next slide, please.
Okay, virtual schools. Now, California has a long history of hybrid and non-classroom schools. Unlike other states, California allowed charter schools to offer instructions in settings beyond the traditional classroom-based model since the beginning days of charter schools, which is almost 30 years ago here, 1983. And so we also already had a reform of non-classroom based charters, which was SB 740, which was passed in 2001. And its purpose was to ensure adequate funding was spent on staff and direct educational services. The other point before I get to the bullets is that the large majority of, quote, non-classroom charter schools in California are hybrid. Some days students spend in the classroom and some independent study. Far, far fewer students are enrolled in programs where they are virtually never in a traditional classroom. And so the conversation in California has been about those totally virtual schools. And this interest came all about prior to COVID, which everybody does non-classroom based work for the last 2 years. But AB 1505, which now seems like ancient history, was in 2018, imposed a moratorium on there. And the core reason on it was that there were some abuses. There were some clear scandals like the A3 schools and some others about how some charters were incentivizing parents to enroll that were just looking very problematic. Now, with the pandemic, we've gotten a little slow on catching up on stuff, as I think others have alluded to. All the oxygen's been sucked out of the room. Just surviving COVID is the large, big thing that's going on right now. So the push to have the moratorium was part of a larger deal with some other reforms that came about with AB 1505. But it reflected the fact that we didn't quite know what to do. With the pandemic, we're pushing it off again. How it's funded and other the implications here, frankly, are this is two implications. One is we want to, in fact, I think in California, get the opportunity for us to preserve the innovative stuff we're doing. But on the other hand, we also want to make sure we address some clear abuses, and we may look to the work that's been done in other states. Tom, back to you.
Yeah, I would just from a national perspective, I mean, pre-COVID, there was lots of discussion, as you know, nationally about the extent to which virtual programs get the job done, particularly for disadvantaged students. And now we've had a national experience where a huge percentage, if not almost all of the population, has experienced this model, which is a real game changer in how people think about this stuff. There are still policy issues out there, I think, that people wrestle with, like, what's the funding formula? Does a virtual school without brick and mortar get the same kind of funding? That stuff, I think, will continue to be fought over. And kind of the looming kind of policy question about whether a school model that depends on an at-home parent is kind of in keeping with what we expect of public schools, and how are there ways to address that issue? I think we'll still continue to see play out.
Okay.
So then, oh, go ahead. I
was going to say, let's be concise so that we can get to conversation across the states. So
yeah,
we can be a little briefer. Go ahead.
Okay, so the other thing that's happened more recently in California is, so just for some context, California has a law that says you approve an application unless there are some fatal flaws to it. So the default is you approve an application. What was added to our statute was a new ground for denial that talks about how the charter school fits into the whole local education system as a whole, the interests of the entire community. And they enumerate some factors like, how's it going to impact the finances of the district? Is it going to duplicate existing district programs that still have capacity? Is it going to undermine some district programs? That's new territory for everybody. It's framed in that negative way and not in terms of opportunities for charters to help, because of the way that California's law is written. It has engendered a lot of fear in the charter community that it's another and a squishier means for bad acting authorizers just to turn down anything they don't like, but it's still in development, and CCAP is working on a resource to help authorizers noodle through that, which is new territory. So that's a short version of that.
And do you think how much? I think a key part that's likely to travel across states is the issue about looking at the impact on the district of a charter school proposal. Is there any more, what's the latest in terms of defining how districts could do that, and for having clarity what it means to be able to talk about the impact on your district of an application?
Yeah, and just for some context, I skipped the first bullet, but many states have provisions in their statutes that talk sometimes more narrowly about an authorizer can consider the enrollment impact in the fiscal, but just in general, this is new territory for everybody. And one context here, there just haven't been a whole ton of applications because of COVID. So some district authorizers and county offices are kind of sorting through, well, how do we do this? What factors can we look to? Who defines the community that we're considering? Those sorts of things. So it's still in its early stages.
Okay. Well, let's pause for a minute and take questions or comments about the California experience. Anybody have any reactions or questions for our California colleagues? I do have one. I'd be curious what Todd thinks. I think the California version of the ban on for-profits is better crafted in the precision that it uses than stuff like what's in the U.S. Senate or proposals we've had in Colorado. Is that, on the ground, does that mean that there are not schools operated by EMOs in California now? Is it, Tom or David, does it have that impact when you're all said and done?
Oh, you're back to us. I thought you were picking on Todd.
Yeah, no, I have one question for you
Sorry,
before we move on.
Go ahead, Dave.
I do think we're still unwinding a few things. And for the most part, it was again some of our hybrid schools that needed to unwind and find their freedom. I think that's happening. There's still some questions about CAVA and others about is there enough independence in the operation of those schools from their former owners. So I don't think that conversation's over.
Thanks. Any other questions before we move on to Florida? Okay, then I'm going to turn it over to Wendy and Melissa. Oh, no, I'm sorry. In the slides, I'm going to go next. My bad. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of Colorado. Let me just say that I've got a couple of things that are viable and that seem to like they're passing and moving now. But we have had, as Todd explained, I think we have had experience in the last few years with a series of what the charter advocates consider to be pretty hostile bills introduced that would also change like the standard of the review of charter proposals, address the impact on the districts, try to deal with various items, and they honestly haven't made it out of their first committees. So the charter opponents continue to put things into the mix that the charter sector feels like are a significant threat to the sector, but they don't go very far. But we do have interest amongst some pretty well-placed legislators in making change, but it tends to not come to fruition. I will say that charter schools have had some recent victories. In particular, we had a major change to allow charter schools to have their share of money that's raised by districts from local mills, from their property taxes for operational issues. And that has changed the financial environment for the charter schools to the better. And then we also have an ongoing annual budget fight about how to get better parity for the Colorado Charter School Institute schools, which don't receive as much money as the district approved schools. And so the state is constantly trying to figure out how to backfill some of that funding for the Charter School Institute to have better parity. So those are the sorts of things we talk about pretty much every year in Colorado in terms of charter policy. But the biggest developments I'd say that we've been having are around services for students with disabilities. CACSA has been working on this for a while, and our members have been quite active in talking about it. We had a round of OCR complaints last year that led to some state board rule changes. And I think this is an issue that might travel from one state to the other. The Office for Civil Rights at the federal level basically says a charter school cannot ask about a student's disability status prior to enrollment. We had a bunch of charter school websites that were found to do that, and the advocates complained about it, and OCR said, you really have to fix it. So the districts and the charter schools really quickly resolved their websites, clarified that they weren't asking for the information or stopped asking for it. So we've had that change happen on the ground, and we'll see how it moves forward. The state board reacted by saying that just as a matter of state board rule, charters may not ask about any protected status during enrollment, and that then they have to figure out what to deal with students that might need more severe services after they're officially enrolled. So a student might not actually end up being educated at a charter school, but they get through the whole enrollment process without looking at their IEP, and then are supposed to figure out what to do if a student has more severe needs. That may work out as expected. We'll see how that works. They are updating another set of rules that will be more impactful for all of choice in Colorado. The provision currently, the charter schools are part of the district LEA, local education agency, and the district retains the right to say that a kid with a more severe disability can't go to a charter school because it's more efficient to serve them elsewhere. The confusion about what counts as a severe enough disability to account for that has led to a lot of miscommunication and misperceptions in the field. So the state board is saying that if the district has to serve a student in a different location, they have to first defer to the parent's choice. Next, they have to examine whether the school of choice can provide a free appropriate public ed under our federal laws. And they also have to explain the rationale for why a student would be located elsewhere than where they would have been if they didn't have a disability. And they do that through official channels through IDA. All of that is going to change, not just in charter schools, but interdistrict choice, focus schools, and magnet schools will all be much more constrained in their ability to direct students with disabilities somewhere else. And happy to talk about that. At the same time, we have a proposal coming from our charter support organization, the Colorado League of Charter Schools, which would allow charter schools to join our statewide authorizers, basically their LEA for special ed purposes. We call them administrative units. It will also allow charter networks to form their own AU, or for charter schools to form a collaborative. This would allow charter schools to act basically like Colorado or California SELPAs or our BOCES and create an administrative unit that would get them out from under the district's oversight and operations and give them the funding that would otherwise go back to the districts to support special ed. That bill's likelihood of passage, I think originally I sort of expected there to be sort of district concern and skepticism, but we're starting to hear of districts that think it's not a bad deal if they had less responsibility for the charter schools' mistakes through litigation or due process, and that maybe it would be better if the charter schools had all the responsibility and had to figure out how to provide a full continuum of services through their own continuum, through their own collaboratives or networks. I think it's really interesting. We'll look forward to see how it plays out, and where I think the CACSA members, if I polled them today, would probably be divided on this legislative proposal, with some thinking that this is maybe the way to go and others skeptical about it. So those are sort of the biggest things that I think that are actually moving, and we'll continue to have bills that might affect our appeals process or the standard of appeals or the process by which districts get challenged about the quality of their operations. So I'll stop there. Any questions for Colorado, or anybody from Colorado have any comments or anything else they'd like to bring up?
I have a question,
Alex.
Alex.
Yeah, go ahead.
So how, is there a criteria for the new AU? And does it have to be approved by an entity?
So yeah, to be approved as a new AU, they would go through a rigorous process that is similar to what would happen if districts wanted to form an intermediate unit, or what we call BOCES. So one of the questions in the drafting is whether it's the same process or the same rigor, or whether it would change a little bit. But that would be their criteria for forming it. And then once it's formed, there's a set of criteria for a school to join it that get to the demonstrated record of the school to do a good job with its special ed, or thorough plans that outline a good strategy for how they could improve their operations. The question is whether right now the districts would not have a right to block that. What their opportunity to object would come in revising the contract for the charter, and they might not revise the contract or put stipulations in there that the school could then appeal to our state board of ed.
And what is considered a collaboration?
Pretty much a collaborative is allowed under state law already, as any two or more charter schools coming together to perform a function that one of them has the responsibility for. So you could form a collaborative for school lunch programs, you could form a collaborative for transportation, and they're sort of already established in Colorado law. But there's no test to become a collaborative other than the schools declaring it. And then the networks are also loosely defined as just any single operator running more than one school. And there isn't a process to be approved as a network, just that it describes your legal status.
Hey, Alex, there was a question in the chat that asked just the levy sharing. I can't remember whether it was a proposal or it's already started, but how's it kind of calculated? And I'll just tag on a question. What are the politics around that? I mean, that's a feature of chartering in Cleveland, where I did a lot of work, and there, you know, on the one hand, you could say, oh, it's the district's losing money to the charters, but really the reality is these levies pass by 51 or 52%, and having the charter sector in alliance with the district has been favorable for them. So just curious.
Yeah, I would say Colorado school districts now know that if they want to pass a mill levy override, that they need to include the charter schools in order to politically safely pass it. And that also comes for the bonds for facilities. We tend to use bonds as one type of elections for facilities, and then we use mill levy overrides often for operational things in the districts. And we have very tight finances, so the districts are very constrained. So most districts do include the charters in both the mill levy overrides elections and the bonds now as a matter of politics and just doing right. The districts can still allocate the mills towards specific purposes. And in most cases, the charters are supposed to just get a flat pro rata share of it. But the district can say, we're going to do a mill levy just for early childhood, and we will only share the mill levy with schools, charter or otherwise, that have early childhood programs. So they don't always get the money, but most of them are being written in such a way as to distribute it. This doesn't affect long, old standing mills that the charter schools may not get. But it has improved the parity in funding, but we're still not really close to parity of funding for charters and district schools. Any other questions or comments on that? Okay, let's move on to Florida, and I will share those slides.
So in Florida, we are tossing around the idea of a state authorizer, and so the state authorizer idea is very new to Florida, and the way that it's being proposed is different than any other state. So basically, a state authorizer in Florida consists of 7 members. Of course, it's appointed by the Commissioner of Education. And if you change the slide, Alex, the entities that we already have in place that can authorize charter schools are listed here. These have been in statute. Well, the last, the State University and Florida College System, those were just added last year. But as you can see, we don't have a state authorizing entity yet. So one of the things that causes district authorizers a little bit of angst is the fact that if you change the slide, Alex, this particular, the way that it's set up in this particular bill is that it just approves charter applications. That's all it does. And then it goes no farther. And then it takes the approved applications and passes it on to the districts in which they've applied for their location. And it hands off those new schools to districts to oversee. And so that's what makes it a little bit different than what we see in other states. And we believe that the reason why this even surfaced in the first place is because, of course, there were some decisions that were made by districts that, you know, of course, lawmakers felt were unfair, and so they felt like if they created this body that can approve applications that seemed more fair, that this would be an appropriate, you know, way to move forward in the charter realm of Florida. But the thing that we talk about most around within our districts is that it's really an unnecessary entity in the way that it's being presented right now. We're not against alternate authorizers, but this particular model just doesn't seem like a good fit. And so for decisions that have been made against applications, if they are denied, we already have an appeals process in place. So if an applicant feels that the decision was made unfairly, they can appeal it, and then they can go through that process. If it's a renewal application and it's been denied, then they can take it through the administrative law judge process. So we've got processes that work and that are fair, and that that ultimately do what is needed to make sure that there's an even playing field. I would say just last year in 2020, we had 62 applications in the state of Florida. 20 of them were withdrawn, 40 of them were approved, and 2 of them were denied. And I bring that up because I think it's an indicator as to the fact that district authorizers are doing their job, and they're doing it well. In the fact that 2 of those applications were denied and neither one of those went to appeal, it says to me that the work was done right, and that it was done fairly. And then the 20 applications that were withdrawn, the way that districts usually handle their applications, they go through the rigor of review, and then oftentimes they communicate with the applicant, and they let them know one way or the other if it doesn't look like a strong application, and then those applicants will withdraw before actually going through the entire process. So I bring that up to simply point out that in Florida, at least Florida district authorizers feel like there's already a mechanism in place to catch fair decision making, and the fact that the data shows in last year's applications and then the way that they were reviewed, that it shows that districts are doing what is appropriate. Go ahead.
I'd like to put a pin in one thing there. The idea that you actually had 40 charter schools approved last year is so so much bigger than what's going on in Colorado. We used to have at our peak maybe 12 and 15 new schools a year, but in the last few years we've been having like 2 or 4, new schools open each year. So the idea that you've got 40, was that a big? Did you ever go down to lower numbers than that, or is that sort of an historical rate?
We have gone lower than that. But it's not a historical. I mean, we have gone as high as that, we've gone higher than that, and we've gone lower than that. But I think just the sheer fact of the matter that it was, during the pandemic, it speaks volumes as well. So.
And if I could just add, that we, last year, Florida passed what is considered almost universal vouchers in Florida, and that is having an impact on the charter population in the same way it's having an impact on the district population. So with this additional choice, we're kind of seeing a slowdown of charter applications as people look for other ways to serve students under the new program.
Great. All right. And other details about 758?
Yeah, so the other piece of 758 is the renewal piece that has everyone kind of looking sideways. It actually changes the criteria for non-renewal. And so the only way that a school can be non-renewed is if it's under a deteriorating financial condition, which before we had a clause in the statute that says it could be non-renewed if there were other good cause shown. And so often in cases of non-renewal, districts then provided the burden of proof to show that there were other reasons for not renewing that charter school. If this language is added to that statute, then obviously it gives us no other reason to non-renew. It also changes language for the term, for the contract terms. They cannot be less than 5 years. There have been incidences where renewal contracts have been renewed for 3 years, sometimes 1 year, because there have been some issues, but maybe it was a brand new school and it was just finishing its first 5 years. It was finding its footing, and districts have sometimes felt like it was in the school's best interest to provide them a 3-year contract rather than a 5-year contract, just to keep tabs on where they're going. And so now the language in the law changes that. And then also it adds a 15-year contract renewal that must be granted to schools that receive an A or a B. So it does change some things in the way of renewals for districts as well. And so we'll be interested to find out how far this goes. It does look like it has legs. It's running very quickly to the finish line. And so, we've got our eye on it.
Yeah, and Tiffany had a comment in the chat there as well, that what happens, the definition of deteriorating financial condition or financial emergency is actually a very low threshold of financial performance. Right. So one of the things that I would find troubling is that this implies that the schools with F's and D's and C's are entitled to 5 years. And if you even just get the B, then you're entitled to 15. We in Colorado are increasingly exploring shorter term renewals with conditions attached to them, with 2 and 3 year renewals with explicit, benchmarks the schools need to make as a way to differentiate our authorizing for schools with a particular problem. And we're finding that that is effective for dealing with particular schools, but not stopping the districts from giving 5 years to the rest. Comments or questions on this one? Oh, I guess one question is, maybe you can speak to the constitutionality of it. Like if the state is insisting that the districts authorize it, I know the reason you've had problems with state authorizers before is constitutional language saying that the district should oversee their schools. Is this looking like a constitutional end run, or will it likely stand if people challenged it on that ground?
So it is true that previously in Florida, we did pass a statewide authorizer that was actually modeled on Colorado's law, and it was struck down by the Florida Supreme Court, and it was never appealed. So the past few years in Florida, this alternate authorizer or state authorizer has been filed, but it has always been a joint resolution that would have had to go to the voters to put in the Constitution. And so this is the first year that they're trying to do this solely through statute. And there are questions in terms of the constitutionality, especially with what Melissa mentioned in terms of the way it's the state approves it and then sends it down to the district to monitor and support. So I believe that if it passes this way, it probably will be challenged, but that's not the way Florida does things. They make you challenge it and prove that it's wrong.
Okay. Any questions about this 758, Senate Bill 758 in Florida before we open it up sort of a general discussion?
We had one other one.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll get back to sharing the slide. There you go.
Wendy.
So HB 5101 is what an education conforming bill, which is something they do in Florida. They file a separate bill to make changes to any of the funding formulas. And so part of the provisions in that bill impact virtual charter schools. We have had an issue in Florida with a very small school district in the Panhandle that approved a virtual charter school application. And the issue that has come up is that very few students in the district are attending the charter school, and most of them are from South Florida, which, if you know how Florida's shaped, they're not very close to each other. And so it has been causing funding issues. It's been causing an issue with the sharing of local millage dollars with students who are not from the area. And so there are issues. First of all, we do not have a separate contract for virtual charter schools in Florida. We do have a separate application and evaluation instrument. So this language requires that there be a standard virtual charter contract that the Department of Education would develop, and it would be a model that would be used, and also a renewal contract. And then it aligns the funding with other virtual programs in Florida, which is the way it works for others that other virtual programs outside of the virtual charter world, is that you receive local dollars for your local students. And if you attract students from other districts, you do not receive local dollars. So there's it's just a different funding model. And then they also did, with the accountability in that bill, they make sure that because school districts in Florida, the charter schools are included in your school grade, they make sure that only the local students are included in the school grade, and students outside of the district don't reflect. They would still reflect on the virtual charter schools grade, but not on the school district. And so those are the issues. That bill has not passed yet. It will be part of our budget conference that's coming up in the next few weeks, and we'll see what happens with that language.
Great. Questions or comments for Wendy and Melissa on that front? I will say, for parallelism, here in Colorado, we had a process by which multi-district online schools had to be approved by the state, and different thresholds for review. When the pandemic came and so much remote instruction happened, we basically waived the state system for the review of online schools during the pandemic. And we're trying to figure out when to get back into the old process, and that will likely create a policymaking window in which they'll revisit the process for approving our online schools that go for multi-districts. So we're sort of anticipating that people who did more remote will want to keep that as a offering, as a possibility, either in an emergency case or just as a supplement to their school when it wasn't in their original charter. And so one of the questions is, if a charter school wants to continue doing that, do they have to go back to the authorizer to have it approved? And if it has kids crossing district boundaries, does the state have to approve it? And so the flexibility, I think, expires this year, and we'll be going back to the old system at some level, but it's one of those hybrid things right now.
And we had a similar issue in Florida last year, but it was with a school district attracting students from outside the school district. And so there was language put in the law last year that limited no more than 50% of the students in your virtual school could be from outside of your district. And so because the charter schools are not, they're exempt from that statute, this issue has come up in Santa Rosa. And so we're just working through it legislatively, as we always do.
Yep. All right. Other questions or comments? Feel free to put it in chat or just go ahead and speak out. David, did you want to talk?
Well, the only point I was going to make is that all the stuff about the virtual, I think, is good conversation. For California, we also have the part that the districts going forward are also looking to have some flexibility on how to do this, and it goes to the heart of how we do attendance accounting and all of that. So while there may be a very good discussion about the charter piece, it is a larger conversation in California.
Sounds good. Todd, if I could circle back to you, what do you think of the different things we're describing in each of our states might go from one state to another? And what do you see, in terms of legislators model on each other, so that we should be thinking of whether or not Coloradans need to know or care about what happens in Florida and California and vice versa?
Yeah, I think, well, it depends on kind of the set of things. I think sort of if you think about like what I consider like the teachers union playbook of anti-charter school ideas, that stuff travels from state to state. Let's put caps in place. Let's, eliminate non-district authorizers and appeals. Let's re-regulate. Let's cut funding. That stuff travels. I think the more nuanced stuff, it doesn't travel as freely, as quickly. I think it's sort of through groups like this, or through groups like NACSA, through groups like the Alliance, some, national groups that kind of connect people in ideas. We have a Alliance of Public Charter School Attorneys that, is another vehicle for these, I think more nuanced policy issues around special education or other things, for them to travel that way. And I think, a lot of the three kind of main states here have had charter laws in place since the early to mid 90s, right? And, a lot of the issues just reflect a very mature movement. And, things that were initially overlooked or not thought about. And as things have played out on the ground now, it's like, we need to, fix this or give this flexibility or tighten this loophole kind of thing. And, we often, we have our own model law. But in addition to sharing our model law, we often, when somebody asks a question like this whole LEA issue, or, who's the, LEA for special education, often try to share different approaches, right? That, from one end to the other and everything in between. So I think a lot of these ideas are just kind of good grist for that. And I think they do travel from state to state, but just not as quickly as the anti-charter stuff travels, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah. Hey, there's a question in the chat. I think it's appropriate for all the states, from Tiffany, who was asking about during the charter renewal process, and I assume application process too, how much people are actually able to look at access and equity and inclusion in the charter schools as part of the process of the review. Tom and David, do you want to take a crack at that one first before I do? And it's also getting at the demand for the schools as part of a charter application review.
Well, I think there's a increasing amount of attention paid to the communities in which they serve. That goes back to the community impact. And we do a lot of authorizers do a lot of look at the populations to be served and the educational expectations. It's also important on the renewal process. Our challenge on the renewal process is that our state, like many, our statewide assessments are are not in place or aren't reliable for this purpose. So while there's increased interest, there is also a clear lack of tools to do it well. And so it's a mixed bag depending on how some of our authorizers do it. I would suggest that Corey's on it, Araceli's on it. They may speak to it better in terms of how they're doing it in their respective counties.
Yeah, Corey or anybody else want to talk about how that's working in California?
As far, yeah, I think we're still flushing it out and it's still relatively new. I've had some experience at the district level, but it's just taking a deeper dive and an analysis. But I think the path forward is still unclear when we talk about the community impact. So this is really kind of the first year of implementation. We're kind of muddling our way through it.
Yeah, I think we have interest of exploring the authenticity of the connection to the community from charter applications in Colorado. But honestly, the thing that becomes a bigger blocker lately is this, that we have a lot of charter applications that don't have enough total interest, period. And so people are used to approving a strong looking application, but then you get down to it and there are too few families signed up to make the school viable. So that was sort of pre-pandemic where that was already pretty problematic. And then the pandemic sort of shut things down quite a bit in Colorado. So we're curious to see what will happen coming out of it. But we're also becoming a state that is stopping a huge growth period that we've had for the last like 15 years. And so we're for the first time having declining enrollment in a ton of districts. And we do have some really full markets of charters. So they're making it harder and harder to find enough families interested in a new one.
Yeah, and if I could
Anybody
just
else with a
tag on
Go
to
ahead, Tom.
that from the California end. I mean, as I understood Tiffany's question, part of it got to like an RFP where you maybe the authorizer is saying we're particularly interested in such and such a program that would fit into the sort of the network that we have for public schools generally. You know, in California, again, our law reads you approve it unless. So the authorizer, I don't think there's anything wrong with an authorizer saying we're particularly interested in a school that would meet this identified district's challenge. But in terms of approval or renewal criteria, I don't think you could go there under our very limited laws that take away a lot of discretion on that. And then the question becomes, if you're looking at that stuff, do those considerations rise to the level where it does fit into our statute? Like to Alex's point, if you don't have enough demonstrated enrollment support or that kind of thing, does that trigger the provision of the law that says it's demonstrably unlikely to succeed? But that's a pretty high threshold for those sorts of conversations.
One quick thing to put a button on that is it does entertain the idea of saturation too with this new statute. So that does give districts that are saturated a little relief as is prescribed in statute.
And I think it's good to keep in mind, one of the lessons I've learned by working across California, Colorado, and Florida is that the California people feel pretty prescribed by previous litigation and jurisprudence. And they're pretty limited to, if the law says you can do it, you can do it. If the law doesn't say you can do it, you probably get sued if you tried. And in Florida, their legislature has constrained a great deal of these procedures. And so there is the statute, or the legislature figures out the contract framework you're working from. The legislature dictates, what you can do. Here in Colorado, I think we have a much more judgment-based system, and you end up sort of having challenges to the state board, but there's a lot more discretion and variance in what districts do here in Colorado.
So one thing we're doing up in our area is, because of that uncertainty on the statewide data for student success, we're going in and helping charter schools with their local data to make sure they have legitimate systems in place and they're able to have longitudinal data and discouraging switching vendors from years. And then one thing, actually kudos to Corey, a shout out to him, was talking about the signs of distress, which may have actually come from this group. We're actually going in and trying to work with boards to consider that and look at those, and then look for the 3 columns for how schools could be. And then each year of the annual review, having them do an analysis of which column they're in. So just to make sure the authorizers and the charters are taking the best steps each year with the unknown.
Great. Given the unknowns, I guess I'd like to raise one other issue that's interesting. California, would you like to comment on your sort of statewide 2-year extension of contracts language? I think that's a very interesting development. Can you provide a little background on that?
Well, I think the best way to put it was with COVID, everything was such a challenge. There was so much to try to do just to keep educating kids, whether remote or all that, that frankly, a political decision was made. We don't need this. We don't have tools to do this well. All the oxygen's out of the air, out of the room because of the challenges. And so I think political parties, players on all sides said, let's just put this off and with the hope that in 2 years we'll be in better shape. I don't think it's much more sophisticated than that, but it really did bring down a lot of anxiety on a lot of people's minds who have other jobs to do at the same time.
Yeah, I would say it's interesting because we've been having increasing numbers of short 2-year renewals in Colorado, and the sector treats it as a potentially hostile act, whereas in some respects in California it was the political solution to how challenging this is to just take care of the opportunity cost of putting so much work into renewal when the data is weak, and say, hey, let's put this off for 2 years. You can still take action if there's an emergency, but let's wait. Whereas when districts in Colorado give a 2-year renewal now, saying, hey, it's really hard on this data to make a judgment, let's revisit this in 2 years, that's a hostile act from the charter community. So it sort of depends on the context where you're in, whether or not having a 2-year extension is considered a friendly or hostile act.
And I'd love to hear from some of my colleagues from California to see what their thoughts are. Our concern, or my concern, is that frankly, we still haven't been paying enough attention. We believe the 2-year extension in some ways is a gift. Gives us an opportunity to make sure, like the stuff that Joe Hendricks was talking about, making sure the charters have data in place that's reliable and usable. So we'll just have to see.
Okay. Anybody else from California with reactions to that?
I mean, it makes sense. So we're so data driven with our renewal, as a lot of states are. We have to establish a new baseline. So it's just not there. So it made sense on multiple fronts just to give that relief even to authorizers as they, districts kind of refocus on the urgency of their neighborhood schools.
I will add one other thing, and that's on the legislative front, is that I expect to see, before the pandemic, we already had a lot of policy debates about the future of accountability and state testing and how the systems work in general. And that was sort of put on hold or challenged by the pauses in testing and accountability. But I expect one of the things to be on people's agenda coming back is to revisit the whole accountability systems at the state in general. So in Colorado, we have an ongoing legislatively mandated audit of the state accountability system underway that is designed to launch a policy discussion about 10 months from now about how we should remake our accountability system. And then one of the points I've been trying to make from CACSA is that I hope the policymakers will understand that the authorizers applying the accountability system is one of the most important implications or impacts that it has. And but we're not considering that as we think about how to redo testing and accountability in the state. It's all from a district operated school perspective, even though the districts are also the authorizers. Do you expect those debates in California and Florida over the accountability system in general?
So in Florida, while we paused the accountability system, they did not have testing the first year. And last year we did have testing, and they had what they called an opt-in situation where the students were tested, grades were calculated, and then based on the results, a school or district could opt in and decide whether they wanted to take the grade if it was an improvement, or not take the grade if maybe it was not going to be favorable to the school. And that way we have what we call a turnaround system, which affects both traditional schools and charter schools, wherein if you're in a turnaround situation, your school has to have a recovery plan, for lack of a better term. And so if your grade during last year got you out of that system, you could take the grade. but otherwise it was optional for everybody. This year, we are looking at moving to a progress monitoring type of accountability system, which is under debate. And this is happening at the same time as we are moving to new standards. So the new standards have been implemented. Sorry, I didn't know the phone's gonna go off. New accountability standards and new academic standards have been adopted by the state over the past few years. And then a new testing system will have to be developed anyways. So it's a good time to move to a different type of accountability in terms of progress monitoring. And I'm gonna mute so you don't have to listen.
I was going to say, one of the things Governor DeSantis has proposed was to do away with the spring annual testing on the one test and to go to a different system. Does that have any legs? Is that going to happen?
So that's part of this progress monitoring proposal, but it's not really an elimination of end of the year testing. It's just moving to 3 progress monitorings throughout the year, with the third one occurring in the spring, and so the first 2 would be adaptive after the system is in place, and that third one would be a static test that would be used for the same type of accountability as we have now.
Okay.
So
And is there legislation
issue,
go ahead.
yeah, so the issue that I would like to kind of bring a bubble up is we've had 2 years of pandemic. Now we're having probably 2 more years of change in accountability. I do love the short-term renewal model, but we may have to consider something else, because we have schools that may have terms that we've extended prior to the pandemic, extended or done some short term because of the pandemic. And now, we're going to have to look at what do we do for another 2 years. So we could have schools with like 7 years of operation and only 3 years of data or less.
Great challenge I think many of us are facing. We've been talking amongst, I think, within each state about how is renewal going to work with the current state of data and the current state of assessment, and then what are the implications for districts that try to make a decision based on it, given our appeals processes and other things, like will we get overruled if we try to close a school based on this data? I would say so far in Colorado, in terms of how the appeals work, we are still seeing districts manage the closure of schools that need to close so far. I'm really not too familiar yet with cases where a district has tried to close a school and been unable to do so. But usually our districts are also exercising some compassion and really, sort of partnering with schools in crisis to figure out how to get through. And when they're done, the schools surrendering their charter after sort of a prolonged struggle. So we're seeing more of that than a school that wants to keep going, has 300 kids in the building, and the district says you're just not good enough. That we don't see very often. It's usually a lot more problems going on in Colorado. Is there other topics that are coming up in the policy debates that are sort of indirectly affecting authorizing? And so one thing we're going to be dealing with is an increase in funding for like special ed in Colorado and general funding changes. And we're also dealing with, in the same way we're dealing with accountability, those are things that are moving that are bigger than charters that will impact us. Is there anything else really big and moving in your states that will have an indirect impact on authorizing?
We have a similar thing going on in California, where there's a lot of discussion about how to sort of reorganize how we do the funding formula. And we have these intermediate entities that you mentioned, Alex, SELPAs, and the funding is to them, but how you calculate how the allocations work is a broader conversation that affects both districts, but also charters, especially charters that are their own LEAs.
So I don't know if Wendy or Melissa talked about it, the bill related to the Charter Institute at Miami-Dade College, which is one of the local colleges in Miami. I think that is going to be an impact on authorizing. We don't know exactly what it means, but you have a college that has no authorizing experience that is going to be, determined to be the expert in authorizing when we already have FACSA. So I think that's something I'm sure Melissa is very concerned about. And we as members are also concerned about. There's just no need for it, but there's obviously an agenda And we don't know what the agenda is. It even, I think, has attached to it a $1 million appropriation, annual appropriation. So yeah, there's some concern there.
So we didn't include that in our slide. That moved in through one committee in the Senate, but it has not been moving in the House. And so we just don't consider it to be something. It'll be available for amendment, obviously, because it did move in a committee in the Senate, but I don't think it's something that's going to happen this year.
Okay.
And just a little background on that. So you have a potential university higher ed authorizer that hasn't done much so far, but would be supposed to get up and running and also serve as the authorizing sort of model and technical assistance center for the state in spite of FACSA and all its record and work. Is that a fair summary?
So last year, Florida passed legislation to authorize state universities and colleges to be authorizers, but no rules have been promulgated yet. And so no one has had an opportunity to do that yet. The institute would be a separate entity that is supposed to guide and provide support and oversight for other authorizers. And again, they would have to hire people to provide that support because they just wouldn't have anybody in place that had that kind of experience.
So that there was a law that did pass a few years ago, something very similar through Florida State that never really got off the ground either. So, that's why I was a little concerned, because if it passed once, it could pass again. But Wendy has, more knowledge of what's going on in Tallahassee than I do. So I'm hoping she is absolutely right and on point with that one.
Yeah, I will say from my old NACSA days when I worked on policy for NACSA nationally, there were several states that created the ability of higher ed institutions to serve as authorizers, and the authorizers declined to ever act on it in a few states. Whereas opposed to Minnesota, Michigan, they're big and active authorizers, and often very high quality, rigorous authorizers, I should add. But other states that had the option, the higher ed system said no thanks. Yeah.
Well, I think the difference here. The difference here, Alex, I think, and I'm glad Wendy's on because I just need some clarification. But with the Institute, it's my understanding that it would not do authorizing. It would just be a guidance entity for authorizing practices. But we already have the universities and college systems that are authorized to by last year's bills to authorize charters. And my understanding is that there are about 2 or 3 that have inquired. So they're poking.
Yeah, I would add one of the things that we've seen in Florida and California is a legislative effort to stand up or to have one of the current stakeholders play a role as the authorizing expert and technical assistance agency. And that's been a constant sort of source of potentially there's resources to support our work, and also, they're going to give it to somebody else who doesn't understand our work for ideological reasons or something else. And so it's good to know that all 3 of our states are working on relationships with our state departments of education to get, to partner with the state on being recognized and maybe get resources for that. And both California and Florida have ongoing financial relationships now with the state departments to do that. So when the legislature weighs in and so, by the way, let's fund we should help authorizers. Maybe we should give somebody money to do that. It's really unfortunate that their first thought is not to give it to our groups.
Alex, we're getting close to the end. I wanted to encourage some people from the areas that haven't spoken yet to tell us what they're thinking and seeing and experiencing.
Perfect. Anybody who hasn't had a chance to weigh in? And Sarah, what's up in Wisconsin?
I'm at the resource center, so I pride myself in saying that I don't have any control over these decisions. I don't make any decisions. I don't influence anything. I don't advocate, but I'm there to support. So, I just kind of roll with the punches. But I've been doing this a long time, and I see the trends and see the problems that arise as a result of decisions that are being made. But no, I think, I mean, we have 400 school districts, about a quarter of them authorized. That's been the case for a long time. We have university authorizers. We have an official statewide authorizer, but all the universities are also statewide. And then we have like these random, legislative proposals that don't make any sense with what's actually going on in the system. And so I just sort of wait and see what happens. But I think it's not great. I mean, I think our authorizer quality is not great. We're working towards better, but again, something that I can't control. We don't have any authorizer standards. We don't grade our charter schools, so the accountability piece is weak, but that's the Wild West that is Wisconsin. So I don't know. It's all right. We're trying. I call it like, I don't know, like I infiltrate my best practices, but not, it's all just sort of people have to choose it, right? So.
Right. Thank you.
Thanks.
Anybody else with questions or comments or stuff going on that we should know about? Anybody else? All right. Well, let's turn to sort of reflecting on what we've heard. I'll start with Todd. If you've got any reflections, anything you're taking away that's new to you today, or cautions or suggestions for us.
I think, I'm sorry, I'm off screen here. School is getting out early because of weather, so I need to go pick up a child. I think the discussion, well, a number of things stuck with me, but I think the discussion around the virtual issue that, Tom in particular and David brought up, has been something that we've been thinking about, for a while, and just how, pre-pandemic, I think that there was a certain level of recognition that these schools were no longer too big to fail, that authorizers were finally taking some, needed action to not renew schools that were chronically low performing. And there was a recognition among policymakers that they needed to put in place some new policies. And, I think the pandemic was a big gift to some of our most struggling virtual operators. And so we've been really struggling with that issue, with how, we've always felt this should be an option for families, but man, we need to do it a lot different than we have. And it's even more acute now, kind of post, or not post pandemic yet, but as we're, at the stage of the pandemic. So, so it was just, that was helpful conversation for me. And, I don't think there are any clear answers on how to navigate it, but it was just a reminder that that's a big challenge we're facing, and the context is very different than it was 2 years ago.
Great. All right. Anybody else with observations? How about from our team in Florida? Any closing thoughts or lessons you'd suggest the other states should pay attention to from your experience?
I don't know if I have a closing thought, but I apologize, Todd. He's got to leave to go pick up his kid because of the weather. It's currently 83 and sunny here in Ocala today, so maybe that helps. Maybe it doesn't.
That's just a cheap shot.
I wanted to say I don't necessarily have a lesson learned, but a more of a response to the sense of urgency around accountability measures. And it just makes me think, and be more mindful of the fact that we really need to get a handle on what those are going to look like for all of our states, and how are we going to guide our each authorizer in the way of renewals, most particularly, because I can't tell you how many districts right now have schools that are in the they may have just opened 2 years prior to the pandemic. So they had 2 years of grades, not great grades. They suffered through the pandemic. We are now at year 3. They are finishing their their 5th year of a contract. They'll be renewed next year, but they have no school grades except for the first 2, which weren't good in the first place. So that is the rule, not the exception here in Florida. So I almost would like to figure out how many schools we have in that category right now. But I think the sense of urgency around that is kind of what was ringing a bell as we were talking.
Yeah, on that front, I would say we had more discussions about this sort of during the first year and a half of the pandemic, and now people are back to work, and I think it's still going to continue to be a big deal. I did an analysis of the Colorado charter schools, and about 92% of them were going to come up for renewal with charter contracts that ended, in which they clearly were going to have 2.5 to 3 years of sort of missing or incomplete data. So like almost all our charter schools really come up for renewal and be affected by this. So look forward to more on that. And our folks in California, I do want to say, if people are leaving, please take a few minutes, or a minute is all it should take, to respond to our survey for feedback on this, which includes questions about like what you'd like to see future NN4DA webinars address. And we've got some coming up. But any other closing thoughts from California before we sign off?
Just one observation, that it seemed to me that there were a number of instances in our discussion today where the sort of the fundamentally the authorizer charter school relationship and how it works is something that everybody is thinking about. I mean, the pandemic meant we're all kind of in the same lifeboat. If we're in a state that has really aggressive voucher, that threatens all of the public, you know, the public schools, charter and district. And there's just a lot of, or we lack accountability data. So other ways to check in more frequently. And not so long ago, both schools and authorizers kind of felt like the more arm's length, the better. And I think that events have forced us to rethink that in a lot of ways.
Okay. Any other closing thoughts from anybody who'd like to share? All right. Well, I'd like to say thank you very much for joining us. Do respond to the survey. The 2 topics we have tentatively scheduled for the next 2 NN4DA webinars are dealing with virtual instruction issues and dealing with sort of the evolution of accountability. But we are totally open for ideas. Let you know the NN4DA Governing Council is meeting next week to talk about next steps and in our organizational development and fundraising and things that we can do. For those of you that aren't in our 3 states, where part of that discussion is about what we can do for other states in the meantime. And we look forward to having more conversations like this. Other than that, I think that's going to wrap it up for us today. Really appreciate everybody's time and input. And Todd, thanks a lot in particular for joining this insider authorizer community for discussion and sharing everything. But with that, I'm going to sign off and hope you all enjoy your either frozen, snowing, or sunny weather.
Thank you, Alex.